What would you do if the people next door sent you more than $250,000 in fines for rules that were never written for you, never voted on by you, never applied to the land you live on, only for you to find out, sitting alone at your desk at 2 in the morning, that not only were they outside their lane, they had built their manicured little kingdom right on top of land controlled by you? A black mechanic who just wanted a quiet place to change oil and watch his daughter grow up. I still remember the morning it started. The sky over Brookdale barely bright, the gravel of my driveway still cool under my boots, when I walked out to my rusty black pickup and saw a thin white envelope waiting in the mailbox. One of those official-looking ones with block letters stamped across the front, notice of violation. And at first I thought it was junk, a wrong address, some computer hiccup, because my place sat on 3 acres just beyond the edge of Maple Ridge Estates, outside there. Pretty gates, outside their HOA, outside their business. And that was exactly why I'd bought it. Space, air, no one telling me what color I was allowed to paint my shutters or how many tools I could stack in my shed. Inside, my wife, Elena, was setting plates on the breakfast table, moving the way people move when they're trying to keep mornings soft for kids. And our daughter, Maya, 10 years old with cereal crumbs on her chin, looked up at the envelope in my hand and asked, "Daddy, did you win something?" And I laughed, the kind of laugh that already has a crack in it, and said, "Probably just junk mail." Even though something about those block letters sat wrong in my gut. I tore it open at the counter, smoothed the page out with my palm, and read it twice, because the first time I honestly thought my eyes were lying. Unauthorized structure detected. Fine assessed, $500. Issued by Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. My jaw locked so tight it made my temples throb, because the unauthorized structure they were talking about was my shed, the one I'd framed out with my brother one brutal summer, sweating through our shirts while we joked about how this was the kind of project you did on your own land so nobody could complain. The shed that now held Maya's bike, my old lawnmower, a lifetime of tools with oil permanently under the handles. "Babe, what is it?" Elena asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel as she came closer. "They're fining us," I said, handing her the letter, the words tasting bitter in my mouth, "for my own shed." "That's the HOA next door," she said, squinting at the header. "That can't be right. We're not in Maple Ridge." "I'll handle it," I told her, and I meant it. But I could already feel something tightening in my chest, the way it does when you recognize the shape of a fight long before the first punch lands. By the end of that week, another envelope showed up, then another, like some vindictive subscription service nobody asked for. Each letter a little harsher, a little bolder, the numbers climbing like someone leaning on a gas pedal just to see what happens. $1,000 for an unsanctioned gravel driveway, $2,500 for a non-conforming fence, $200 because my porch light apparently offended their definition of subdued exterior lighting, and the stack of paper on our kitchen counter grew higher, wider, uglier. "They're harassing us," Elena whispered one night after Maya had gone to bed, her voice shaking in that way she hated because it sounded too close to fear. "They're going to bury us in paper until we break." I tried to shrug it off, because I'd spent my life pushing back against people who thought they could control me, bosses, landlords, cops, you name it. But the letters kept coming, their language sharpening like knives. Final notice, escalation pending, legal action recommended. And I started to notice the way people in Maple Ridge Estates looked at me when I drove past. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence at the grocery store, a man from behind those iron gates muttering just loud. Enough for me to hear, "Some people think rules don't apply to them," and pretending he was talking to his wife instead of staring straight at me. One evening, my friend, Calvin Price, showed up, leaning his tall frame against our kitchen counter, flipping through the stack of HOA letters like they were a bad deck of cards. And Calvin, who spent his days counseling teenagers at the high school and his nights talking grown men off emotional ledges, shook his head and said, "This is ridiculous. Derek, your land isn't part of Maple Ridge. They have no jurisdiction." And I said, "Tell them that, because sometimes it's easier to be cynical than hopeful." "They're banking on fear," he said, resting a hand on my shoulder. "They think you'll just pay to make the noise stop." "They picked the wrong man," I answered, and I meant it, but I didn't yet know how wrong. It didn't stop there, of course, because people like the Maple Ridge Board never stop at one lever when they think they've found a new toy. They started using my name in meetings, turning me into a cautionary tale, non-compliant, defiant, threat to property values. And the story traveled faster than anything resembling truth, parents pulling their kids a little closer when I walked by, cars slowing when I mowed my lawn, drivers staring like my existence was vandalism. So one night, after the fourth week of notices, after Elena had given up asking if this was the last one, and Maya had finally stopped asking why the mail made us go so quiet, I sat at my desk with only the glow of my old computer lighting the room, and I started digging deeds, plats, county filings, the whole dry maze of land records my grandfather used to talk about like a second language. My grandfather had owned this land before me, and his father before him, and I remembered stories of how they'd fought to keep it through hard times, through offers that were more insult than money. So I knew in my bones that Maple Ridge had no claim over me. But I needed more than bones now. I needed paper. File after file blurred past my eyes, the legal jargon stacking up like a third language I'd never been taught. And just when I was about to shut it down and try again another night, I saw something small, easy to miss, tucked inside the records for a business deal I'd barely remembered, a development company I'd gone in on with a few friends 5 years earlier when we were trying to be ambitious for once instead of just tired, nothing big, or so I thought. The company's name, Northline Holdings LLC, sounded like every other boring corporate shell, but the entry sitting in front of me was anything but boring, because it showed that Northline hadn't just bought a sliver of land for access roads around Maple Ridge Estates. No, the holding company had acquired title to the very ground under that subdivision, the dirt, the lots, the underlying tract. And sitting right there on the screen was a line I read 3 times before I let myself believe it. Majority ownership, Derek Cole. I froze, staring at those words, and slowly, very slowly, a smile crept across my face, the kind that doesn't come from joy, but from the sudden realization that the whole board you've been playing on is tilted in your favor and nobody else knows it yet. Because while the HOA board had spent weeks puffing themselves up, mailing threats, telling anyone who'd listen that I was a problem they needed to stamp out, the reality was brutal and kind of hilarious. They were standing on land controlled by a company I practically owned. Their tidy houses, their stone entrance, their smug gate codes, all of it built over a foundation that legally pointed back to me. My shed, my gravel driveway, my porch light. None of that was the real story anymore. The game had changed, and as the first light of dawn slid through the blinds and painted a pale line across my desk, I understood something else too. This wasn't the end of the fight. This was the starting gun. The next day, I told Elena I was going to their HOA board meeting, and she set her coffee down very gently and asked, "Are you bringing what you found?" And I said, "I'm bringing just enough," because I knew better than to waste the biggest card in a room that smelled like lemon cleaner and cheap authority. That evening, Calvin met me in the driveway, calm as always, wearing a plain shirt and that look that said he'd stand between me and a train if he had to. And he asked, "You sure you want to do this?" Not because he doubted me, but because real friends ask even when they already know the answer, and I told him. They dragged me into it. I'm just walking to the front of the room. The Maple Ridge Clubhouse sat across from a man-made pond with stones arranged so neatly it looked fake. 2 plastic geese frozen mid-strut, and when I opened the door, the smell of disinfectant hit first, then the hum of fluorescent lights, rows of folding chairs lined up for people who wanted to be told what to think and go home satisfied they'd fulfilled their civic duty. At the head table sat the board. HOA President Gerald Thornton in a navy blazer way too formal for a room full of neighbors, silver hair combed like a closing argument, and next to him Vice President Susan Blake, fussing her papers into perfect stacks, peering over her glasses whenever anyone whispered. The rest of the board members lined up like a panel that had practiced looking serious in a mirror. They noticed me the second I walked in. Of course, whispers skittering through the rows, a woman nudging her friend and tilting her chin toward me, a man folding his arms like his posture could build a wall between us. But I didn't look for allies. I took a seat in the front row, folder in hand, because I wanted nothing and no one between me and that table when it was time to speak. Gerald went through landscaping updates and pool repairs with a smooth patter, the kind of tone that makes running a community sound like reading off a grocery list, and people nodded along, until he got to an item called Ongoing Compliance Matter, Order Parcel, and his voice shifted just slightly. Enough for everyone to know the main show had started. As many of you are aware, he said, hands folded like a judge, we have worked diligently to bring a neighboring property into alignment with Maple Ridge standards. Uniformity protects everyone's investment. Exceptions threaten that. The board has acted in good faith to correct violations. And he never said my name. But he didn't have to. The way heads turned toward me did that for him. I stood up, walked to the little microphone set aside for public comments without waiting to be invited, laid my folder down on the metal ledge, and said, I'm the man you've been finding for a shed, a driveway, a porch light, on land that sits outside your gate. And that alone was enough to make a few people suck in a breath. I pulled out a county parcel map, bold lines showing boundaries even a kid could understand, held it up long enough for the first couple of rows to see, then set it where the board couldn't ignore it without admitting they were ignoring it. And I said, your bylaws end where this fence line ends. The county recognizes it. Your own filings recognize it. You don't have jurisdiction on my side. Susan glanced at the map like it was a piece of junk mail, sniffed, and said, this is out of context. Our bordering provisions are clear. And I answered, show me the line that says you can enforce rules inside my gate. And a low murmur rolled through the room, just enough to make shoulders shift and eyes flick to one another. A woman in the third row, scarf looped neatly around her neck, name tag reading Janet Morales, raised her hand and asked the question that should have ended all of it. If the county map shows his boundary clearly and his deed doesn't include annex language, are we spending our dues on a case we can't win? And the way Gerald refused to look at her told the whole story. He talked about strength and consistency and protecting standards, words that sound noble until you realize they're just camouflage for control. And when he finally threatened to escalate through legal remedies, I closed my folder, looked him in the eye, and said, if you want a courtroom, find a judge who reads maps. They voted to authorize legal action, of course, hands raised in a tidy row, like they were checking a box instead of lighting a fuse. And that night a volunteer chased me into the parking lot with an envelope from some fancy law firm. Courtesy copy, he said, before scurrying away like courtesy was contagious. I didn't open it until I sat at my desk, with the same calm I use when I'm staring at a rusted bolt that refuses to turn, read their threats about failure to comply and demand for payment and legal action authorized by the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, then slid it beside my county map and the deed for Northline Holdings LLC, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace, not because the fight was over, but because the battlefield had finally come into focus. On Calvin's recommendation, I hired attorney Laura Kent, a woman whose office was small, uncluttered, and heavy with active files instead of ego. And when she read through the letters and the map and then the Northline deed, she leaned back, let out a low whistle, and said, they don't just lack jurisdiction over your house, Derek, they've been swinging a stick over a cliff with no ground under their feet. Can we stop them? I asked. In court, she said, yes, and if they're foolish enough to push this, the judge isn't just going to toss their fines, she's going to question everything they've been doing. And if we have to bring up Northline and who controls the land under their subdivision, well, that's not a card I'd want played against me if I were them. When the first hearing rolled around at the Harrison County Courthouse, the gallery was packed with Maple Ridge residents and a couple of local reporters who smelled a good HOA train wreck from a mile away, and their lawyer, Bradley Hines, stood up in his expensive suit and talked about fairness and uniformity and protecting investments, painting me as some kind of reckless outsider whose refusal to follow their rules threatened civilization. Then Laura stood, calm as a surgeon, handed Judge Naomi Ellis the parcel map, and said, Your Honor, before we talk about standards, we have to talk about standing. This association has none over my client's property. He is not, and has never been, a member of Maple Ridge Estates. Their own boundary filings admit it, and I watched the judge trace that line with her finger, nod once, and say, then that's where we'll start. At the full hearing a few weeks later, when the time was finally right, Laura laid out not just the lack of jurisdiction, but the ownership trail under Northline Holdings LLC, how their million-dollar homes and pretty cul-de-sac sat on ground controlled by a company whose majority shareholder was the man they'd tried to bury in fines. And you could feel the room tilt, slowly, as the reality sank in that the non-compliant problem they'd been gossiping about wasn't just outside their gates. He was, legally speaking, under their feet. In the end, Judge Ellis kept it simple, because truth doesn't need fireworks. She ruled that the Maple Ridge Estates HOA had no authority over my property, that every fine they'd levied was void, that their case was dismissed in full, and that if they wanted to keep playing games with borders and bylaws, they'd better learn where their power stopped. No payment owed. $250,000 of threats, gone in one strike of the gavel. Outside, residents argued on the courthouse steps, some furious at the board for wasting their dues, some angry at me for humiliating their HOA, some just confused about what it all meant, and a reporter shouted, "Is it true you own the land under their homes?" And I said, "What's true is this: they never had the right to come after me." And a lot of people in that neighborhood just learned what happens when power climbs over the fence line. Weeks later, Gerald resigned quietly. Susan followed. The HOA shrank back into its proper box, and life on my 3 acres felt normal again in all the ways that matter: mowing my yard, working in my shed, sipping coffee on the porch while Maya rode her bike under the porch light they once tried to find me for. I had the leverage, if I wanted to use it, to make their lives very complicated, to remind them every single day that their foundations ran through a company whose paperwork listed my name in bold. But most days I chose not to, because I didn't buy land to become a petty king. I bought it so my family could breathe. Still, on quiet nights, when I look across the fence at Maple Ridge glowing under its street lamps, I can't help asking myself, and maybe you too, when people in power cross a line and try to crush someone who never owed them anything, how far is too far when you finally push back? Is it enough to make them stop and pay the price in court? Or is real justice using every ounce of leverage you have, even if it shakes the ground under their perfect lawns the way they once tried to shake the ground under you?